The truck comes up the lane slow, the way trucks do when the driver isn't in a hurry, because he knows you're already watching. I am standing in the barn doorway, with a milk pail hanging from my right hand, steam lifting off the metal in the cold, and I can see the headlights sweeping through the fog that sits on the pasture every December morning in Tillamook County. The gravel pops under his tires. He parks where he always parks, just past the cedar post with the rusted mailbox, and he sits there a moment before he opens his door, which tells me everything about why he came. I know why he came. I have known since October that he would come, sooner or later, hat in hand or something close to it. 9 months ago, I was standing in a different kind of gray room, the county probate office in Tillamook, a Tuesday in March, a clerk sliding a manila envelope across a laminate desk and saying, the key ring was with personal effects. The key ring had 11 keys on it, and I didn't know what most of them opened. The envelope also contained a default notice, printed on cream-colored letterhead, dated March 4th, for $26,700 in outstanding equipment loan principal owed to a regional agricultural lender. The farm, 6.8 acres, 41 goats, 1 aging milking parlor, was now mine. So was the debt. But that is 9 months back, and right now the Creamery manager is stepping out of his truck and pulling his collar up against the wind off the Coast Range, and I have 41 Nubian Alpine does who have already been milked and are standing in the morning light eating hay with the particular composure of animals who have no idea what any of this means. I set the pail down on the barn floor and walk out to meet him. He is in his late 50s, broad through the shoulders, with a face that has spent a long time in weather. He has run the regional creamery facility for more than 20 years, and he has seen small dairies come and go the way you see seasons come and go, without particular surprise, without cruelty. When he dismissed me, back in March, he was not being cruel. He was being precise. He was telling me what he believed to be true, which is a different thing, and I want to be fair about that even now. He raises a hand in greeting as he crosses the gravel. The fog is thinning at the edges, but it's still sitting heavy over the lower pasture, and the smell of the morning is salt air and cedar and the faint sour warmth of the milk parlor behind me. He stops a few feet away and looks at the barn, then at the goats in the paddock, then at me. "Miss Callie," he says. "Morning," I say, and I wait. The way my aunt taught me to wait. Not with folded arms, not with a hard face. Just still, just listening. That moment on the gravel is December. Let me take you back to where it started, to a kitchen table in early March, when there was nothing in front of me but a piece of paper and the particular silence of a house where someone has recently died. The default notice came on a Tuesday. I remember the date exactly, March 4th, because it was stamped in red at the top right corner of the envelope, and because I sat at my aunt's kitchen table for a long time looking at that stamp before I looked at anything else. The morning light was coming through the east window at a low angle, the kind of flat gray-white light Tillamook County makes in early March, and it lit the paper up like something clinical. The loan balance was $26,700. The lender's officer had signed his name below a paragraph explaining that the account had entered default status and that further inaction would trigger acceleration of the full balance. I read that paragraph 3 times. I had $2,140 in my checking account. The dairy had 41 goats on 6.8 acres and a processing contract with the regional creamery that, according to the second letter in the envelope, was under review for cancellation within 60 days. I put the letters down. I made coffee in my aunt's percolator because I hadn't yet bought my own, and I stood at the window looking out at the paddock where the goats were standing close together in the cold, their breath coming in small gray puffs. They looked patient. I tried to look patient too. Then I drove the 11 miles to the creamery. It took me 22 minutes on Route 6 with the truck heater working hard and the wipers on intermittent because the fog was starting to settle into something between mist and rain, which is what fog does in Tillamook in March. I had both letters on the passenger seat. I had not called ahead because I was afraid that if I called, he would find a reason not to be available, and I needed him to see my face. He saw my face. He brought me into his office off the main floor, where it smelled of warm milk and industrial cleanser and the faint metal bite of the refrigeration equipment running behind the wall. He sat across a metal desk from me and he read both letters, or he read enough of them, and then he set them down with the careful, unhurried motion of a man who has delivered unwelcome facts many times and has learned that gentleness in the delivery does not change the content. He told me the contract would be canceled at the 60-day mark. He told me the herd was too small. He told me the volume was inconsistent and that the co-op's collection schedule couldn't accommodate a producer at my scale without a guaranteed minimum he did not believe I could meet. He said all of this the way a man reads a tide table. Not a judgment, not a dismissal, just the water doing what the water does. I asked if there was any part of the arrangement that could be preserved. He told me I could keep a reduced arrangement, 40 gallons of whey per week, hauled at my own cost and schedule, as a courtesy until the 60 days were up. Then he stood, and I understood the meeting was finished. I drove home on the 101 with both hands on the wheel and the heater running loud and the letters on the passenger seat. The road was wet. It had been wet for 2 weeks. Tillamook County in early March does not apologize for itself. The next morning, I walked the 6.8 acres alone. I had been on this land before, summers as a girl, but walking it as the person responsible for it is a different thing entirely. The pasture behind the barn was soft enough to pull at my boots with each step, the grass still winter pale and flattened from frost. The fence line along the east edge needed 3 new posts and at least 40 feet of wire. The equipment shed held a rented pneumatic milking system that was, as of the default notice dated March 4th, technically collateral against $26,700 I did not have. I counted it all, I walked it all. I made myself look at the number of broken things versus the number of working ones. Then I went to count the goats. 41 of them. Nubians and alpine crosses. Most of them, their ears long and ridiculous, their eyes calm and indifferent to my grief. They stood at the gate in a loose cluster and watched me the way goats watch everything, with interest that refuses to become urgency. I counted them twice, 41. My aunt had fed and milked and cared for these animals through her 70s and into her 81st year, alone most of that time, in this county, in this rain. Standing in the mud looking at 41 pairs of eyes, I felt the debt and the silence of the place land on me at the same time, like 2 hands pressing down from opposite shoulders. That evening I didn't eat much. I sat at the kitchen table with the probate envelope the county had mailed me, the deed copy, the loan notice, the key ring. The key ring had 7 keys on it, and I had identified 6 of them over the past 3 days. Truck, barn, equipment shed padlock, milk house. 2 I hadn't placed. The kitchen had a long wooden cabinet built against the north wall. I had opened every door and drawer in it, every one except the narrow center drawer, which had a small brass keyhole that I had registered but not tried. I tried the 6th key. Nothing. I tried the 7th. The drawer opened. Inside was a spiral-bound notebook, the cover water-stained to the color of old tea, the wire spine bent in 2 places as though it had been rolled and unrolled from a coat pocket more than once. I set it on the table and opened it to the first page. My aunt's handwriting was small and tilted, the letters pressed hard into the paper like she had meant every one of them to stay. The first page was dated 6 years back, November, and it started mid-thought the way my aunt did everything. No preamble, just the fact of the thing. 11 dozen milk, barrel hay down to the last third, morning temp 38, dropping. Bags look tight on 3 of the Alpines, watch the back left on 7. She had numbered the goats, not named them. I had been calling them by color and marking, the way you do when you don't know any better. I turned the page. The entries came every few days, sometimes daily through kidding season, sometimes with gaps of a week in summer, when, I figured, there was nothing unusual enough to record. She wrote about feed ratios, about weather and its effect on letdown, about a stubborn doe who kicked through 3 milkings before settling. She drew small diagrams in the margins, udder shapes, teat angles, the angle of a hind leg mid-kick, done in ballpoint with the quick confidence of someone who had drawn the same things 100 times and was drawing them again only to remember. The pages were soft at the edges, the paper slightly waxy from hands that must have been damp more often than not. I turned pages for an hour before I found the entry I did not know I was looking for. It was maybe 2/3 through the notebook, a February entry, the handwriting slightly larger than usual as if she had written it in better light, or with more intention. She had been experimenting with adding whey to the winter ration, a small amount, she noted, 10% of daily liquid, mixed into the grain mash so the goats took it without fuss. She wrote about the results over the following 3 weeks, with the careful attention of someone watching something prove itself. Bag tension even, she wrote. No mastitis flare. Pull came easy, not fighting the letdown reflex. And then milk color, she had underlined this. Deeper yellow, cream, sitting high in the jar after an hour. And then, at the bottom of the entry, separated by a line she had drawn with a ruler, whey-fed does, calm bags, rich pull, never waste the sour. Underlined twice. The second underline pressed hard enough that it had scored the page beneath. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Outside, the rain had shifted to something between drizzle and mist, the kind that doesn't make noise but finds every gap in a coat. The kitchen was cold. I hadn't fed the wood stove past 10 o'clock, and it had burned down to a low pulse of red behind the grate. I didn't get up to add wood. I just sat there with the notebook open on the table and thought about the Creamery's disposal line, that hose running into the collection tank, the faint sour smell rising off it in the morning cold, the 40-gallon limit the manager had spoken like he was doing me a favor by allowing even that much. The sentence sat in my chest, the way a hard fact does when you know it's about to change something. I went back on a Thursday. I had spent 2 days with the notebook, reading it front to back and then in pieces, and I had done the arithmetic on a yellow legal pad until the numbers stopped moving around on me. 40 gallons a week was what he'd offered. That was 40 gallons I didn't currently have. I wrote down what I knew about whey composition, the proteins, the lactose, the mineral load, from the extension pamphlet I'd found folded inside the notebook's back cover, my aunt's pencil checks beside the lines she'd believed. I wrote down what my aunt's feeding logs showed about the months she'd run whey into the ration. I did not write down what I was going to say to him. I didn't want to say much. The Creamery sits off a county road about 4 miles east of the main highway, a low corrugated building behind a gravel apron that always smells of warm milk and bleach. I got there at 7:15 in the morning, before the first processing shift was deep into its run. The manager was in the receiving bay in rubber boots, watching a milk tanker back in, and he turned when he heard my truck door. He looked at me with that measured patience again. The same look he'd had the first time, not unkind, just settled in his certainty the way a stone settles into creek mud. I told him I wanted to haul whey. I said I had 2 20-gallon drums, food-grade sealed lids, in the bed of my truck. I said I understood the facility's disposal cost was roughly 4 cents per gallon, and that I was offering to remove up to 40 gallons per week at no cost to him, which would reduce his disposal load by a small but real margin. I said I'd sign whatever liability waiver he needed for an agricultural feed application. He let me finish. He looked at the truck. He looked back at me. He said 40 gallons a week was fine, he supposed. He said it like a man agreeing to let a child keep astray, not cruel, just certain it wouldn't amount to anything worth tracking. He said he'd have the floor supervisor note it in the logbook. I said thank you and walked back to the truck. The floor supervisor helped me position the drums under the secondary discharge line, and we filled them without much conversation. The whey ran pale yellow and thin, with that faint sour edge that hits the back of the throat if you breathe near it. It smelled like something between buttermilk and rain on concrete. I rolled the drum lids tight, loaded them one at a time with a hand truck, and roped them to the truck bed so they wouldn't shift on the curves. It was a wet October morning. The road home runs through second-growth Douglas fir that drips long after the rain stops, and the cab smelled of diesel and damp canvas from my coat. 40 gallons. That was where it started. The first morning I mixed whey into the ration. I stood in the barn doorway for a long time before I did it. I had my second notebook open on the feed shelf, a plain composition book I'd bought at the hardware store in Tillamook for $1.19. I wrote the date at the top of the first page, November 3rd. Then I wrote the ratio I'd calculated the night before at the kitchen table with a flashlight and the aunt's notebook beside me. 40 gallons per week, spread across 41 goats, across 7 days, works out to just under 1.5 gallons per goat per week. Mixed into their morning liquid at 10% of daily intake, it amounted to less than a cup per animal per day. I'd done the arithmetic 3 times. It felt almost too small to matter. The herd watched me from their stalls with that particular goat expression that is either curiosity or contempt. I never fully decided which. I poured the whey into the mixing trough, cut it with water, stirred it with a length of clean dowel rod, and ran it through the line. Most of them drank without hesitation. Nubians are not suspicious animals by nature. 2 of the older alpine crosses, the one with the torn ear, the one with the off-colored splash on her left flank, pulled back after the first mouthful. They stood at the edge of the trough and watched the others drink with the look of animals calculating risk. I noted both of them in the composition book: ear tier, splash flank, resistant, reduced to 5% this week. Watch. That was the rhythm of it for the next 7 weeks. Every morning before light, I drove the truck out on the gravel, fed the herd, watched who drank and who hung back, and wrote it down. Every 3rd day, I adjusted a ratio somewhere. Every Sunday, I drove the 45 minutes to the Creamery for the next drum haul, loaded in the dark, drove home through the firs. The whey sloshed faintly in the drums behind me, and the cab smelled the way it always smelled: diesel, damp canvas, that thin, sour edge threading through everything. Neither of the 2 resistant goats got sick. They simply needed longer. By the 3rd week, the ear-tear doe was drinking her full cup without pulling back. The splash flank doe took until mid-November, then one morning she just drank it all the way down, like it had always been ordinary. I wrote that down too. There were no dramatic moments. That is the part I want people to understand. Wherever you're watching from, whatever state, whatever county, if you've ever worked something slow like this, you know that the work doesn't announce itself. I ask myself that question sometimes in the dark of the barn. Is anything actually happening here? The goats gave no sign either way. They ate. They drank. They settled into the new ration the way animals settle into weather, because it had simply become the condition of their days. The composition book filled up slowly, page by page. The neighboring dairy farmer came by on a Tuesday in late November, a cold, bright morning, with frost still on the fence wire. I heard his truck before I saw it, that particular diesel idle, heavy and unhurried, the kind of engine that's been broken in over decades of the same roads. He pulled up along the south fence line and sat a moment before he got out, and I knew he'd been watching from the road first. That's the way men like that approach things. They observe before they commit to approaching. I was rolling the second drum off the flatbed when he came to the fence. He had his hands in his coat pockets and his hat pulled low against the glare off the pasture. He was maybe 60, maybe a little older, the kind of weathered that makes age hard to pin. He ran the operation 3/4 of a mile east of me, about 200 head of dairy cattle on land his family had worked since before the county road was paved. He watched me lever the drum upright on the dolly. "What have you got in those?" he said. "Whey," I said. "From the Creamery." He was quiet a moment. He looked at the herd, which was gathered at the near fence line the way they always gathered when the drums arrived, a habit they'd built themselves, no training required. "You're feeding whey," he said. "Mixing it in," I said. "Started in October." He nodded slowly, not the nod of agreement, but the nod of a man filing information. He looked at the drums, looked at the goats, looked at the notebook tucked in my coat pocket. I'd pulled it out earlier to check a ratio and hadn't put it back properly. "Your aunt tried that," he said. 20 years back, maybe more. It was a thing people did before the concentrates got cheap enough." He paused. "Fell out of practice for a reason." I set the dolly under the drum lip and straightened up. "What reason?" He thought about it. "Too inconsistent," he said. "Quality varies batch to batch. Hard to control what you're actually giving them." He said it without edge, the way a man states a principle he's tested personally. "You'd do better with a standardized supplement. More predictable." "Maybe," I said. He looked at me another moment. He wasn't unkind. He was, I thought, genuinely curious, the way a person is curious about something they've already categorized. He smiled, just slightly, and tipped his head. "Well," he said, "goats." He left it there, got back in his truck, and pulled off the shoulder and drove east toward his own operation, and the sound of his engine faded into the tree line. I went back to the drum, uncapped it, ran the line, checked the ratio in the notebook. Batch variation was real. I'd been testing every haul with litmus and a refractometer I'd borrowed from the co-op extension office since the second week of October. 12 hauls in, the numbers weren't as inconsistent as he'd said. I wrote that down too. January came in like a door slamming shut. The cold snap hit the second week of the month, a hard freeze that dropped into the low 20s 3 nights running and crept up the pipes before I understood what was happening. First morning I woke at 4:30, to no water pressure in the barn line. I spent 2 hours with heat tape and a propane torch, working my way from the wellhead to the trough manifold, fingers going numb inside the gloves, the goats watching me from their stalls with that particular goat patience that looks like judgment. Second freeze hit 4 days later. Same routine, less panic, more time lost. I kept the notebook in my coat pocket those mornings, not for any specific entry, just because it felt like ballast. The early kidding cost me more than the pipe repairs. One of the older does, a Nubian cross I'd started on Whey back in October, went into labor on the 14th, 3 weeks before her due date by the breeding record the aunt had kept tucked inside the notebook's back cover. I stayed up with her the first night. She delivered 2 kids just before 2 in the morning, both undersized, both alive. I got them colostrum within the hour, set up a heat lamp, checked vitals every 40 minutes through the rest of the night. Second night, the smaller one wouldn't nurse without help, so I stayed again. By morning, I was running on 4 hours of sleep, spread across 48. And I'd burned through an emergency bag of lamb milk replacer and 2 supplemental feed mixes I hadn't budgeted for. When I tallied it up, replacer, the extra electrolyte supplement for the dough, a new heat lamp bulb when the first one burned out at midnight, it came to $387. I moved the number from one column to another in the paper ledger I kept separate from the notebook, and I looked at what remained in my account. The lender's officer called on the 22nd. He was businesslike, not unkind, the same measured tone as always, the kind of voice that has delivered difficult information often enough that it has smoothed all the edges off. The February payment, he reminded me, was due the 1st. $1,340. He asked if I anticipated any difficulty. I told him no. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while with the notebook open to the whey feeding log. 12 hauls recorded. 40 gallons a week, every week since October. Ratios, observations, a few notes on milk pull and udder condition that I'd started adding in my own hand beneath the aunt's older entries. I looked at my account balance again, $1,490. On February 1st, I made the payment. $1,340, sent by bank transfer at 7 in the morning before I did chores. I had $150 left. I went out to the barn in the dark and measured the morning whey ration, and listened to the goats settle into eating, and I didn't let myself do the math again until after. The co-op tester came on a Tuesday in the last week of February, when the rain had turned the lane into something closer to a creek bed than a road. I heard his truck before I saw it, that particular sound of tires working through mud, the engine note dropping and recovering. He was a middle-aged man with a clipboard under one arm and a metal case that held the testing equipment. And he came every 8 weeks as a matter of routine, the same way the utility meter reader came, not looking for anything unusual, just collecting numbers. I let him into the barn without ceremony. He set up at the small work table near the door, where I kept the morning's pull already cooled and measured, and I went on with the mucking while he worked. That was normal. He didn't need me watching. He was quiet for longer than usual. I noticed it the way you notice a clock that stopped, not the absence of sound so much as the absence of the right sound at the right time. His routine had a rhythm to it. This time the rhythm broke. He ran it again. I heard the particular click of the equipment resetting, the pause, the same process repeated from the start. I set my rake against the wall and waited. When he came to find me, he was holding the clipboard with both hands, the way a person holds something they want to be careful with. He said the number, 5.1% butterfat, average across the herd. He said it once, and then looked at the clipboard, and then looked at me. He said he had run it twice, because the first reading didn't correspond to anything in his records for a herd this size. Under 50 head, he said, he had never logged this number. He had been testing for the co-op for 11 years. He said that carefully, not as a boast, just as the measure of how long 11 years was and what 11 years of numbers looked like when you held them all together. He said he would have to file a separate notation with the regional office. There was a column for anomalous results. He said he didn't mean anomalous as a problem, just outside the standard range, outside what the table predicted for a herd like mine. I asked him what the table predicted. He said most crossbred Nubian alpine herds at this scale ran between 3.8 and 4.4. 4.6 was high, 4.8 was very high, 5.1, he said again, and stopped. I thanked him. He wrote out the notation by hand on his second form, made a copy, gave me the copy. He was professional about it. No excitement, just the careful recording of a fact that didn't fit the existing column. After he left, I stood in the barn doorway with the copy in my hand. Outside, the rain kept falling. The goats moved behind me in the low sound of the straw. Word moves through a small county the way water moves through the barn floor after a hard rain, quiet at first, tracing whatever channel is lowest, and then suddenly it is everywhere and you cannot remember when it wasn't. The co-op man had barely cleared my gravel lane before someone knew. That is not a complaint. That is just how it is in Tillamook County in March, when there is little else of interest to report, and a 19-year-old's herd has just posted a butterfat number that doesn't fit any existing column. The Portland cheesemaker called on a Tuesday. I was splitting the morning ration when the phone rang in the house, and I almost didn't answer it. He spoke the way people in his business speak, carefully, in hundredweights and protein ratios. In yield calculations I had to write down on the back of the co-op copy because I didn't want to misremember the figures. He had seen the notation. He said that plainly, without embarrassment, that the regional office circulates anomalous results, and his sourcing contact had flagged it. He asked about my operation, total head, breed cross, acreage, current contract status. When I told him the processing contract had carried a 60-day cancellation window from early February, he went quiet a moment and then asked if I was still under it. I told him I hadn't heard from the Creamery. He said that was interesting. The Astoria cheesemaker called that Thursday. Different voice, same vocabulary. He quoted me a price per hundredweight that was above the co-op standard rate. Not dramatically, but enough to matter when you are carrying a $26,700 equipment loan and watching every margin. He said he could take my full supply. He said he had been looking for a milk source with consistent butterfat above 5% for 2 years and had not found one from a herd under 200 head until now. I wrote both numbers on the same piece of paper and set it beside the aunt's notebook on the counter. The notebook's underlined sentence was still there, patient as ever. Whey fed does, calm bags, rich pull, never waste the sour. The notebook had known what it was saying long before I did. By mid-April there was a third inquiry, this one forwarded through the co-op office itself, which I found quietly remarkable. 3 buyers, 1 supply. I was 41 goats on 6.8 acres in a county that had always moved at its own pace, and now I was being asked to choose. I had not yet heard a word from the Creamery manager about the cancellation. The 60-day window had opened in February and closed sometime in April, and nothing had come. No letter, no call, no formal notice. The deadline had simply passed, quiet as a tide going out, and whatever the Creamery had intended to do with it, they had not done. I kept feeding the whey. The goats kept drinking. The Portland cheesemaker called first. He had a direct line and used it, and we talked for 40 minutes on a Wednesday morning in early May, while I stood in the milking shed with the door open and the fog still sitting on the lower pasture. He made cheese in small batches, sold through 2 restaurant accounts and a farmer's market in the Pearl District, and had been looking for a consistent high-fat goat supply for 3 seasons. He asked what I was feeding. I told him hay, browse, mineral, and sour whey, hauled from the regional creamery. There was a pause. He asked how much whey. I told him the ratio and the method and the butterfat numbers, and he was quiet again for a moment, and then he said he wanted first right of refusal on my full output at $18 above the co-op base per hundredweight. I told him I had 2 other inquiries. He said he understood and asked me to think about it. I thought about it for 11 days. Then I called the Astoria buyer and listened to her counter. She was making aged wheels for a specialty retailer in Seattle and Portland both, and she offered 16 above base, but with a volume guarantee that locked in my price floor through December, regardless of what the co-op market did. I wrote both figures in the back of the aunt's notebook, in the margin below the feeding logs. I signed with Portland on a Tuesday in late May, and with Astoria on the following Friday. The contracts were simple enough to read in one sitting. I read each one twice anyway. The Portland arrangement covered roughly 60% of my output. The Astoria arrangement covered the remainder, and between the two, I had a guaranteed price per hundredweight that was higher than anything the regional co-op had offered in the 2 years my aunt had been running the place before her hands gave out and her health followed. I kept the whey feed running through the summer and into fall. The herd cycled, the testing continued, and the butterfat held. I put every dollar above operating costs toward the equipment loan. The balance came down in increments I could track. $14,000 in July, $9,000 in September, $4,000 in October. On a Tuesday in the last week of November, I wrote a check for $3,412 and drove 40 minutes to the lender's office on a road I had driven in March, with a default notice in my coat pocket. The officer who had handed me that notice was at his desk. He accepted the check and gave me a stamped receipt, and said something about it being a good outcome. I folded the receipt and put it in my coat pocket, same pocket where the default notice had been, and drove home through a gray afternoon with the firs standing black against the low sky, and the gravel lane coming up wet and familiar in the headlights. The morning he came was cold and still, the kind of cold that settles into Tillamook County in December, like something that has been waiting its turn. I was in the milk room running the last of the morning rinse when I heard the truck on the gravel, a slow, careful approach, the engine idling down well before the gate. I recognized the sound before I saw the headlights. I dried my hands and went out. He was standing at the gate when I reached it. His truck was a late-model crew cab, dark green, idling quiet. He had his hands in the pockets of a canvas work coat, and he was looking at the herd pen where the does were moving slow and easy in the cold, their breath rising in small, pale columns. He looked at them the way a person looks at something they've misjudged and are only now beginning to account for. He said he'd seen the co-op numbers. He said he'd seen the April contracts. He said what his facility was doing now, the artisan line they'd been developing, required a milk profile he'd been having trouble sourcing. He was polite. He was unhurried. He was direct in the way that men are when they have decided to set aside the version of events they'd been certain about and start from a new position. He asked if I had supply available and at what terms. I told him my current contracted rate, and then I told him what I was charging the buyers on my waiting list. The waiting list figure was the highest number I had put to any buyer, and I put it to him without apology and without softening and without any pause that might suggest I was uncertain about it. He was quiet for a moment. He looked back at the doughs. Then he said, "That would work." I told him I'd have paperwork ready by the end of the week. He nodded and got back in his truck and turned it around slow on the gravel and went back down the lane the way he'd come. I watched the taillights until the furs took them. I didn't smile until I was back inside. The kitchen was warm from the propane burner I kept running in the mornings. The notebook was on the counter where I'd left it the night before, open to the page I'd read so many times that winter that I no longer needed to look for it. The handwriting was my aunt's, small and practiced, with the deliberate loops of someone who had learned penmanship before ballpoints were standard, and the single underlined sentence sat there in the gray winter light, the same way it had sat there in November, in October, in the wet weeks of March when I'd first found it and didn't yet know what it would mean. Wayfed does, calm bags, rich pull, never waste the sour. I put my hand flat on the page. Then I went back